The white light blinds me. Crap. That's idiotic. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. Clearly, I've not been on my computer in a while either, because it's like all these notifications. It's just like all over the place. Okay. I'll just give a couple minutes before we actually start. If you want to follow along, I'll be starting on 2 Kings. I almost said 2 Samuel there. 2 Kings from chapter 9 to chapter 12. But we're going to give a couple minutes before we actually start. I also hate how when you have the light mode on your computer screen, the light reflects off my face. At least as the OBS shows me, and it's just, there you go. Back to darker mode. Because then it just looks funny when the light reflects right directly off your face, right? As opposed to the more ominous and more like palpable appearance that I have when I use this kind of lighting setup. So we're just gonna wait a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Awkward. Alright, that's enough waiting. Hello and welcome to the stream Parson Reads. The Book of Kings. Take 2. So, today, we're going to try and read through what I was supposed to read last week. But last week, I don't know what, I was just in a mood, I guess. And I was so exhausted, I guess, from like earlier in the day doing a bunch of errands. And then not getting enough sleep the night before or something. I was just in crap condition last week. And I don't know what I was thinking when I was like, oh, we still gotta do the Bible stream, right? Because I want to be faithful to doing that. But I was in like the crappiest condition. I was like falling asleep on my own stream, and that was embarrassing, right? I was tempted to take the video down because of how bad it was. But I left it there. You can go laugh at it or something. You can use it like a laugh thing. I don't know. But this is the official part 8 of reading through the Book of Kings, where I will read from 2 Kings chapter 9 to chapter 12. So I just needed to get a little bit of a preface, because we're still reading the same chapters, but we're going to do it right this time. And I'm going to go through the chapters properly, right? Instead of like trying to power through it half asleep and then skip a lot of good content that was in like chapter 9, for instance. So we're going to do it right this time. Going to be a bit of a longer stream because there's a lot more content actually in these next couple of chapters. So prepare yourself. If you want to follow along, I'll be reading from chapters 9 to 12 of 2 Kings. I'll be using the New International Version. Excuse me, my throat is still a little hoarse. So if you want to follow along, please do. I encourage you to. Whip up the Bible app on your phone if you've got it, or BibleGateway.com on your desktop. No reason not to. They're free. You can just use them, right? And I encourage you to use your digital copy of the Bible because, well, not with Bible Gateway, but on the Bible app, you can do all kinds of cool, like, post-sticking and highlighting, and taking other notes as you follow along. Well, the Bible app may be able to turn on your phone, right? And I also encourage you to take notes and stuff like that. So if you have questions and whatnot, feel free to throw them at me. But anyway, I'm going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I just pray that as we read your word, and as important as the moral lessons are, what is ultimately more important is that we are drawn closer to you, and that we come to know you more. I pray that you would reveal yourself to us, even now, in this day and age where it might be unpopular to follow you. But I pray that, that's one of the more important things in life, is to know that we have you as our friend and our comforter. I pray this in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Alright, so just a little bit of preface for as we begin chapter 9. So the earlier chapters just talks a little bit about some of the kings that have come and gone. And of course, one of the major points was the death of King Ahab. Now, King Ahab was one of the kings of the northern part of Israel, right? Because the southern part would be referred to as Judah. And so Ahaz was a really terrible king, right? He practiced all kinds of sorcery and idolatry and stuff like that. And what on top of that, he's known to have like the worst wife, right? And many people use Jezebel, Ahab's wife, as like a passing proverb, advising women what not to be, right? But of course, if you remember from, what was it, like week 5 or something, I talk about how, like, unironically, and I know it's a hot take, so you're getting I mean, we can't call hot take of the week because I've already used this hot take, but she's kind of, Jezebel's like the prime model of feminism. And of course, now I know what some of you might be thinking after I say something like that. Is that like, well, feminism highly associated with sin, and you could make you can make the connection, anything is associated with sin for the most part, but Jezebel kind of takes it to a whole new level, and she's a really wicked person, and so was Ahab, right? But Ahab is dead already by the time we get to chapter 9. And so that was one of the important things that I'm going to point out, because of course, if you remember, what was it, like, I think it was still in like week 5 when we were doing the Elijah story, and Elijah prophesied against Ahab and Jezebel that basically things were going to go real shitty with them, excuse my French kind of thing, but you know, things are going to go really, really badly for them, right? Because of the evil that they committed, right? And so Ahab died in like an idiotic way, right? He gets like hit by a stray arrow. Random, right? Quote unquote random arrow hits him, right? And then he dies from it because he just loses too much blood and he dies from it. So I brought that up because, of course, if you remember from my sleepy stream last week, and I'm going to reread it and do this chapter justice. But basically, Jezebel is going to get, you know, her ill fate come upon her, right? And so I just wanted to point out that's an important highlight to keep in mind here because chapter 9 she's going to get wasted. And then, of course, later, the rest of the chapters we read today will mostly be about these other kings that show up. And then we get closer to 593, which is basically 593 BC is when Judah will fall. Israel falls a little bit before that. I can't remember the exact year. But 593 BC was when Judah falls. And we get closer to that because even though Israel, the northern part, is pretty terrible, you know, the entirety of Canaan at the time, both Israel and Judah, their disobedience to God, you know, will lead God to say, like, well, screw you guys, you know, like, good luck. And then, of course, you know, when God abandons them, for lack of better words, well, then they get conquered, right? Kind of what happens. And so, because of course the spiritual message, if you will, is that, you know, God is the source of your strength. That's what God wanted to remind Israel of. It's like, I'm the source of your strength. So when I leave, well, you're basically screwed, right? And then Israel and Judah will get conquered once God leaves, quote unquote, right? He abandons them, for lack of better words, and leaves them to fight for themselves, and then they get conquered by the Babylonians, beginning the Babylonian exile, which lasts for 70 years. Well, and then you have to add a couple more years before they return, right? So, because they don't like immediately come back, but you get the idea. So basically, from starting this week, as we go through the book of Second Kings, that's kind of the build-up. That's basically what the rest of the book will be about. Be about, you know, the rest of these other kings that some were okay, but in the grand scheme of things, most of them are pretty awful. And then that kind of makes God so fed up that he just like, all right, I'm going to go take a vacation. I'm tired of babysitting your dumbasses. And so he, you know, God abandons them, and then that leaves them to get conquered. Well, you know, we're reading basically the build up to that. Spoilers for an over, you know, 2,500, you know, year old document. That's kind of the direction that we're going through. Sorry, I just have to check something here. Yep. Alrighty. Chapter 9. So the prophet Elisha summoned a man from the company of the prophets and said to him, tuck in your coat into your belt. Take this flask of olive oil with you and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you get there, look for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Now go to him, get him away from his companions, and take him into an inner room. Then take the flask and pour the oil on his head, and declare, this is what the Lord says, I anoint you king over Israel. Then open the door and run. Don't delay. So the young prophet went to Ramoth Gilead. When he arrived, he found the army officers sitting together. I have a messenger for your commander, he said. For which of us? Said Jehu. For your commander, the prophet replied. So Jehu got up and went into the house. Then the prophet poured the oil on Jehu's head and declared, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over the Lord's people Israel, and you are to destroy the house of Ahab your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants and the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel. It's still the prophet talking. The whole house of Ahab will perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. And I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Abiah. And as for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her. Then the prophet opened the door and ran. When Jehu went out to his fellow officers, one of them asked, "Everything all right? Why did this maniac come to you?" "You know the man and the sort of things he says," Jehu replied. "That's not true. Come on, tell us." Jehu said, "Here is what he told me. This is what the Lord says. I anoint you king over Israel." They quickly took off their cloaks and spread them under him on the bare steps. Then they blew the trumpet and shouted, "Jehu is king!" So Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Now Joram and all Israel had been defending Ramoth-Gilead against Hazael, the king of Aram. But King Joram had returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds of the Arameans that they had inflicted on him in the battle with Hazael. Now Jehu said, "If you desire to make me king, don't let anyone slip out of the city to go and tell news in Jezreel." Then he got onto his chariot and rode to Jezreel, because Joram was resting there, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, had gone down to see him. When the lookout standing on the tower of Jezreel saw Jehu's troops approaching, he called out, "I see some troops coming." Get a horseman," Joram ordered. "Send him to meet them, and ask, 'Do you come in peace?'" So the horseman rode off to meet Jehu and said, "This is what the king says. Do you come in peace?" "What do you have to do with peace?" Jehu replied. "Fall in behind me." The lookout reported, "The messenger has reached them, but he isn't coming back." So the king sent out a second horseman, and when he came to them and said, "This is what the king says. Do you come in peace?" Jehu replied, "What do you have to do with peace? Fall in behind me." The lookout reported, "He has reached them, but he isn't coming back either. The driver is like that Jehu, son of Nimshi. He drives like a maniac." "Hitch up my chariot," Joram ordered. And when it was hitched up, Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, rode out, each in his own chariot, to meet Jehu. They met him at the plot of ground that had belonged to Naboth the Jezreelite. When Joram saw Jehu, he asked, "Have you come in peace, Jehu?" "How can there be peace?" Jehu replied, "as long as all the idolatry and witchcraft of your mother Jezebel abound." Joram turned and fled, calling to Ahaziah, "Treachery, as Ahaziah!" Then Jehu drew his bow and shot Joram between the shoulders. The arrow pierced his heart, and he slumped down in his chariot. Jehu said to Bidkar, Jehu said to Bidkar, his chariot officer, Pick him up and throw him on the field that belonged to Naboth the Jezreelite. Remember how you and I were riding together in chariots behind Ahab his father, when the Lord spoke this prophecy against him. Yesterday I saw the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, declared the Lord, and I will surely make you pay for it on the plot of ground. Now then, pick him up and throw him on that plot, in accordance with the word of the Lord. When Ahaziah, king of Judah, saw what happened, he fled up the road to Beth-Hagan. Jehu chased him, shouting, "Kill him too!" They wounded him in his chariot on the way up to Gur near Ibleam? Ibleam. That's a funny word. Ibleam. But he escaped to Megiddo and died there. The servants took him by chariot to Jerusalem and buried him with his ancestors in this tomb in the city of David. In the 11th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, Ahaziah had become king of Judah. Then Jehu went to Jezreel, when Jezebel heard about this, she put on some eye makeup, arranged her hair, and looked out a window. As Jehu entered the gate, she asked, "Have you come in peace, you Zimri, you murderer of your master?" Jehu looked up at the window and called out, "Who is on my side? Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down at him. "Throw her down," Jehu said. So they grabbed Jezebel and threw her down, and some of her blood spattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. Damn. Then Jehu went in and ate and drank. "Take care of that cursed woman," he said, "and bury her, for she was a king's daughter." But when they went out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. They went back and told Jehu, who said, "This is the word of the Lord, that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's body will be like dung on the ground in the plot of Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, 'This is Jezebel.'" Alright, so chapter 9. A lot happened, so we gotta dissect this a little bit. So, as I mentioned in previous weeks, the kingship of the northern part in Israel, I guess Israel proper, the way kings are picked is kind of a lot more gruesome, and it's not very pretty, nor is it very well organized for that matter. And even when God appoints a king, he kind of just like picks a guy at random. And there's no real system there, right? Because, Israel, as I mentioned this before as well, Israel isn't like Judah, right? Because Judah has a Davidic covenant that God set up with King David way back, right? And so they don't have the same there's not a technical system of how to appoint kings in Israel. So with Jehu being just picked randomly by God, I guess, as king, it just kind of, sure, the Bible the Bible tells us that, okay, so Jehu was told he was going to be king, so then he kind of does it, he coronates himself, basically, and then he just goes and does the kingly duties, right? He's not like, when we look at the kingdom of Judah a little bit later in today's read, the northern part of Israel doesn't have that organization. Although, from a historian perspective, I can understand a lot of criticism, even when, quote unquote, God is involved in the selection of kings, because even God doesn't really behave, let alone expect, any kingdom in Israel to really last. God just kind of like, all right, if you have to have a king, I'm going to pick this dude at random, right? And so it's funny where like Jehu is picked as king, and Jehu has like no real qualities, right? We don't know. He's basically a stranger to the audience. And so you're thinking like, well, why the hell would God pick this guy? And that's a good question, right? But I mean, what the Bible presents to us is that like, well, it didn't really matter who was picked as king. What was more important was that they were going to carry out punishment against Ahab and his family. And so, crap, what was his son's name? Not Ahaziah, Joram. Yeah, right. So Joram, who's the son of Ahab, right? Jehu is just the instrument of his destruction, and of course, ultimately Jezebel's destruction as well, because these guys were not good people, right? They led Israel into idolatry, and of course, on top of that, they were committing all kinds of, by our modern day standards, pretty much atrocities, right? Well, I can't even use the terminology modern standards because, unfortunately, in our, godless society, for lack of better words, we're actually committing a lot of the atrocities that like the Bible's paints out to be like, oh, these are pretty atrocious. And then it's ironic that people complain about the Bible being so terrible and violent. It's like, well, people are doing the exact same thing today. Nothing's changed, right? And so, but of course, modern people would like to claim, well, people back then or primitive or whatever, or maybe God made them do it, which is absurd. But, once again, it just kind of proves the Bible's case that like, well, all of us have fallen short of the glory of God, right? Because, even in 2021, as quote unquote progressed as we are, we still commit the same kind of atrocities that are going on here. And then that brings a scary thought, right? Because, we read in something like the Book of Kings, and God is pretty like, forceful on punishing people for these atrocities. And yet here we are in 2021 committing a lot of the same evils that, Jezebel, for instance, was committing. And, we just read the death of Jezebel, and that gets pretty nuts, right? And it's pretty extreme how like, she kicks the bucket, right? Gets knocked over a wall and then like crushed by like horses, and then her dead body gets like devoured by dogs, right? To the point that like, as Jehu says, is like, well, no one's gonna be able to recognize her, so okay, I just have to check something here. Someone's just DMing something to me, but it's not important right now. So it's just one of those like, yeah, so it's something really worth considering, right? Like, we aren't too far away from being as awful as some of the people that we criticize, in the Bible, for instance, like Jezebel, right? Our culture and our society is not too far away from that. And, we read in 2 Kings that God is he's pretty severe on bringing out punishment. And, the ironic thing is that, you read a story like this and you'd be like, haha, Jezebel had it coming, right? Because she was a god-awful human being, right? But yet, a lot of people today are not too different from her. And you wonder, what kind of punishment God's going to bring upon us. Of course, I know the typical Christian response is like, well, we live in the age of grace and all that, right? That's true. That's why, let's just say the punishment hasn't come yet, right? But of course, the book of Revelation tells people something very different, right? That when Christ returns, well then, those punishments for those who are unrepentant, right? For those who reject the gift of Christ, right? Those who, stray away, who avoid God and intentionally push God out, that punishment is going to come, right? And if Jezebel gets like the shit can here, right? It can only get worse, right? It can only get worse. And so it's a scary thought, I know, but I mean, you're on the Streaming Parson channel, and Streaming Parson Bible Reads, it's all about entertaining the scary thoughts, because I don't know, I find it a little bit cathartic. Maybe that's the real reason why, like, you know, unironically, people associate me with like Halloween monsters. I have been called various and not so nice names. And, you know, a well-known name that people have been referring to me as is the Blue Ghost, right? Because I'm like a ghost. I'm scary like one, I guess, and I pop in and out of existence to scare people like a ghost. Or maybe I pop in and out of existence in people's minds, because half the time people don't, you know, people ignore my existence because people are terrible. But, you know, I'm like a ghost, and I wear the color blue a lot. You notice I'm always wearing blue, right? Most of the time. Not always, but most of the time I am. And so blue goes, you know, when it makes sense. But, you know, entertaining, rather, the scary thought is kind of what we do around here. But, and of course I don't do this just to scare you, right? I don't do this to scare you, but, you know, I don't do the typical believe in Jesus or you'll go to hell. Although that's obviously implied in a lot of the stuff I do talk about. But at the same time, you know, like, I mean, I also entertain the scary thoughts that the Bible presents, because of course I try to, I definitely avoid, I don't try to, I definitely avoid, you know, a lot of the misconceptions of like religion as an opiate for people, and like religion as something for the weak-minded or whatever, that a lot of people use to argue against Christianity, which is an idiotic argument, by the way, right? Because once again, you know, I teach the Bible raw, and if you read the Bible, you know, like raw, right? You don't sugarcoat it or whatever. You realize that, like, well, of course, the Bible is never treating Christianity like it's some kind of opiate religion. It's not like an escape religion. You don't believe in Jesus to get away from your life problems. That's absurd, right? Because of course, the Bible obviously teaches the opposite is true, right? It's like if you believe in Jesus, you're asking for trouble, right? And I definitely know that firsthand, right? Where do you think the Blue Ghost name even comes from anyway, right? But anyway, you know, stuff like that. Like, Christianity was never meant to be like an escape for people, in the sense of like, oh, you believe it and then like your life is just better. As a matter of fact, in a lot of people's like a lot of people in a lot of cases in a lot of people's lives, they'll tell you like believing in Jesus has made this life a lot harder. But of course, you know, we also believe that Jesus will redeem us in the resurrection, right? And the resurrection and immortality and all that stuff. And I talk about some of that in the Time is Weird podcast. Definitely check out my podcast with that. But, you know, sure, there's the promise of the next life, but this life will only be more difficult. But at the same time, you know, it goes back to the punishment thing in Revelation. Well, think about the long term in that regard, right? And there's that, you know, real threat of like hell and damnation, right? Like, you know, this life, as crappy as it might be, is only a blink in the grand scheme of things, right? And, you know, a blink in the face of eternity. And so, you would rather things be rougher in this life than to, you know, get a punishment like Jezebel, and even worse, as the book of Revelation presents it, right? The punishment is even worse. And so, it's one of those things that we read stories like Jezebel and be very mindful that, like, God's wrath is a real thing. Even when, like, yes, we obviously live in a time where Jesus can forgive us of sin. And, you know, that's all, in a way, it's all the more reason we need Christ's forgiveness, right? Because the wrath and the punishment is a real thing, right? And so That's another thing people cheapen too, right? Because it's like, well, why would Jesus need to forgive you if the wrath of God also wasn't a real thing, right? The forgiveness almost seems pointless if the wrath wasn't a real thing, because then like, oh, if nothing's gonna happen, I don't need to be forgiven, which is an idiotic thinking, but that's definitely something taught um, in quote unquote modern Christianity, quote unquote. I use that in quotations because, of course, like you question a lot of these modern Christians that believe wishy-washy nonsense that is not biblical and is more like appealing to the watered-down anti-Christian um, thinking. Just like, oh well, we believe in Jesus, quote unquote, but we also, um, we believe in like the culture's version of Jesus, not the Jesus of the Bible kind of thing. But that's why reading old stuff like the Book of Kings is important, right? Because I think the Book of Kings brings that reality back that, like, no, man, there's going to be times when shit hits the fan, like, really hard, right? And that's all the more reason that you and I need to be spiritually awake, right? Because, the alternative is pretty frightening, right? Like, Jezebel is just one instance of, like, of terrible punishment for her evil, right? And the book of Revelation only makes it worse, right? Or only presents it as worse, because with Jezebel's death, it's kind of like, okay, then she dies. It goes in like a terrible, terrible way, but well, then death is the end. But of course, Revelation gives the position that like, no, it doesn't end there, right? Because you you don't die just once, apparently, right? You can die an infinite amount of times, right? Because immortal soul, and then you add death to that, so the immortal soul can apparently die an infinite amount of times, which it's just way worse if you think about it, right? Because that old saying that, like, the legitimate fear of why people think immortality sucks, right? Immortality definitely does suck if you died an infinite amount of times during it, and the Bible says like, yeah, that's a real possibility. So just thinking that, right? Like, it's a scary thought, but at the same time, it's like, we read stuff like Book of Kings, and it's like we should be very mindful that the wrath of God is a real thing. And the danger that a lot of people, when they're reading a story like this, don't just think like, well, Jezebel had it coming, but I'm not as bad as Jezebel, so that wouldn't happen to me, which is a very arrogant thing to think. Because one, all of us as human beings are, Jezebel is another human being, just like you and me. So, Jezebel was clearly capable of doing such evil. Well, she's just as human as any of us, so any of us are just as capable as doing such evil. So, be mindful and watch out for that, right? But anyway, we could go way more into like talk about Jezebel, right? Because there's a lot you can say about her, and the Bible does, like, maybe one day, I'll have someone actually like compile this for me, and then we'll do like a whole study. Because there's other parts of the Bible later on that use Jezebel as like a byword, right? You talk about like how you never want to be this bad, right? You never want to be Jezebel bad, right? And so maybe that'll be a fun study for a future day. But anyway, this is the end of Jezebel, basically. She was pretty bad, right? Because I mean, if you remember way back, well, week 5 or week 4 or something like that, when we were doing the Elijah story, right? Like, Jezebel like went around slaughtering, you know, the faithful, to Yahweh, right? She was slaughtering all the prophets. And then that's like, Elijah was more than well aware of this, right? Because, what the Bible doesn't tell you is that Jezebel was slaughtering all these prophets, and then that's one reason why Elijah felt so alone. He felt like he was the only one left, because the thing the Bible doesn't tell you, but a lot of Bible scholars have theorized about Jezebel's character, is that since Jezebel had slaughtered all the other prophets, when Elijah was given his death threat, when Jezebel threatened his life, that's why he went from like being on top, like Elijah went from being on top of the world to like suicidal, right? But the context, the hidden context, a lot of, well, I can't really say a hidden context. It's more like an implied thing. It's implied in the Bible, and then of course a lot of Bible scholars kind of theorize about this, that like since Jezebel had already killed everybody else, Elijah took that threat very seriously. And that's another reason why Elijah uses the words that he does, right? He talks about like, I'm the only one left. And so even though clearly that's not true, even though like, Elijah met Obadiah, who's a faithful, right? But a faithful to Yahweh. And so, the context was that Jezebel probably killed all Elijah's buddies. And then when Jezebel killed all Elijah's buddies, and then when Jezebel threatened Elijah, he thought he was going to join all of them. Like, oh, I'm the last one, and I'm going to be joining all my friends. 6 feet under and in pieces, right? And so, that's one, terrible crime that we can account to Jezebel. And then, of course, we read in like the week before that one, in week 4, when we were introduced to Ahab and Jezebel, we learned that their oldest children they sacrifice to their gods, right? The child sacrifice thing, which God says never sacrifice children, because that's really effed up, right? And so, and I remember a guy brought up like, oh, wasn't there one guy in like the book of Judges who made an oath to God, and then like God didn't stop him from sacrificing a child? And then it was like, yeah, but then you read the next chapter and God goes on a killing rampage, because that's how, a little bit of an overreaction in the book of Judges, right? When you read the account that basically after a guy, he makes a promise to God to sacrifice something, and then he sacrifices his own daughter, right? And then God goes on this killing rampage the next chapter, kills like 50 plus people. And a legitimate complaint would be, okay, bit of an overreaction, God. The guy only killed one girl, right? Killing one girl isn't equal to you slaughtering 50 people. So a fair complaint against God in that regard, right? 50 people is a bit of an overreaction. A bit being the operative word. But like, a bit of an overreaction. But then, of course, the point of the Bible telling us those two things, right, is to kind of show how much God hated, child sacrifice, that God would just go and slaughter a whole bunch of adults, right? You don't sacrifice children, is basically the point of that story. And so Jezebel is definitely guilty of that, because she sacrificed a few of her oldest kids, probably girls, which, quote unquote icon of, women empowerment, right? Which is, ready for your hot political take of the week, like, well, they're hot takes because they end up sounding political. They're not political in themselves. But obviously, people will make it a political statement, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's a lot like how modern day, abortions kill women more than they empower women, right? Because, the argument the pro-abortion argument is for women empowerment and women health and stuff like that. But then, of course, you look at the reality and it's like more women are killed from it, right? Baby women, but it counts. So more women are killed by it than women are empowered by it, right? So kind of absurd to think that it's a good thing once you put that in perspective, right? More women are killed by it, and it's kind of, the Bible implies that Jezebel killed the women in the family, right? Because, well, of course, you could just say, well, the Bible omits daughters and stuff like that because they're not as important, patriarchy and nonsense like that. But even if that were the case, right, no doubt oldest kids, probably girls, probably useless to the throne, right? Because, of course, you have to think about Jezebel being power-hungry psychopath, right? Having daughters wouldn't ensure your power with the crown, right? Because think about this, like Jezebel still lives in the palace, right? How does she maintain her power and influence over Israel, despite Ahab being dead for a while, right? It's because of her sons, right? Her son, primarily Joram, the current king of Israel. Probably her other sons too, because the Bible hints that there were other male members of the family, which of course God did say he was going to have them all killed, as punishment for Ahab and Jezebel's evil. So going back to, we read in a much earlier chapter in 1 Kings that Jezebel and Ahab sacrificed children, and pretty regularly to Moloch, but yet they still have all these boys kicking around. Yeah, I'm gonna take the darker route here and just say that they slaughtered all their daughters, which is really messed up. You think about it, and yeah, when you put that in perspective, it makes God feel a lot more justified in being as wrathful as he is to Jezebel and Ahab, right? Sacrificing all their daughters like that, like if God is gonna go on a killing rampage of killing 50 plus dudes in the Book of Judges because like one guy idiotically sacrifices his daughter, it can only be so much worse, right? God is only gonna act a lot more rashly, quote unquote, when evil people like Ahab and Jezebel are sacrificing their daughters on the regular, right? Like that's really messed up, right? When you say it out loud and you really think that process through, it's really messed up. And it when you put those things in perspective, it kind of like, okay, now I don't want to say like it justifies, like God slaughtering Jezebel the way he does, but I mean, like Jezebel had it coming, right? Like because she's that terrible, right? She had it coming. Anyway, before I get myself in more trouble by all this Jezebel bashing, because I know somebody's gonna call me out for some shit because of how much Jezebel bashing I'm doing. I'm gonna stop here and move on to chapter 10, because we're already 45 minutes in and we've only read one of the 4 chapters, so we better get a move on. But chapter 9 is like, as you can tell, there's a lot here we could keep talking about, but I'm gonna stop. So, chapter 10. Chapter 10. Now there were in Samaria 70 sons of the house of Ahab. So Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the officials of Jezreel, and to the elders of the guardians of Ahab's children. And he said, You have your master's sons with you, and you have chariots and horses, a fortified city, and weapons. Now as soon as this letter reaches you, choose the best and most worthy of your master's sons. Sorry, where was I? Of your master's sons, and set him on his father's throne. Then fight for your master's house. But they were terrified and said, If 2 kings could not resist him, how can we? So the palace administrator, the city governor, and the elders and the guardians sent this message to Jehu. We are your servants, and we will do anything you say. We will not appoint anyone a king. You do whatever is best. Then Jehu wrote them a second letter and said, If you are on my side and will obey me, take the heads of your master's sons and come to me in Jezreel by this time tomorrow. Now the royal princes, 70 of them, were with the leading men of the city who were rearing them. When the letter arrived, these men took the princes and slaughtered all 70 of them. They put their heads in baskets and sent them to Jehu in Jezreel. When the messenger arrived, he told Jehu, They have brought the heads of the princes. Jehu ordered, Put them in 2 piles at the entrance of the city gate until morning. The next morning Jehu went out. He stood before all the people and said, You are innocent. It was I who conspired against my master and killed him. But who killed all these? Knowing then that not a word the Lord had spoken against the house of Ahab would fail, the Lord has done what he announced through his servant Elijah. So Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. Jehu then set out and went towards Samaria. At Beth Eked of the shepherds, he met some relatives of Ahaziah, the king of Judah, and asked, "Who are you?" And they said, "We are the relatives of Ahaziah, and we have come down to greet the families of the king and the queen mother." "Take them alive," he ordered. So they took them alive and slaughtered them by the wall of Beth Eked, 42 of them. He left no survivor. Not the meaning of take them alive, but you do you, Jehu, you do you. So after he left, he came upon Jehonadab, son of Rechab, who was on his way to meet him. Now Jehu greeted him and said, "Are you in accord with me, as I am with you?" "I am," Jehonadab answered. "If so, give me your hand." So he did, and Jehu helped him up into the chariot. And Jehu said, "Come with me, and see my zeal for the Lord." Then he had him ride along in his chariot. When Jehu came to Samaria, he killed all those who were left of Ahab's family. He destroyed them according to the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. Then Jehu brought all the people together and said to them, "Ahab served Baal a little. Jehu will serve him much. Now summon all the prophets of Baal, all his servants and all his priests. See that no one is missing, because I am going to hold a great sacrifice for Baal. Anyone who fails to come will no longer live." But Jehu was acting deceptively in order to destroy the servants of Baal. Now Jehu said, "Call an assembly in honor of Baal." So they proclaimed it. Then he sent word throughout Israel, and all the servants of Baal came. Not one stayed away, like moths to a flame. They crowded into the temple of Baal until it was full from one end to the other. And Jehu said to the keeper of the wardrobe, "Bring robes for all the servants of Baal." So he brought out robes for them. Then Jehu and Jehonadab, I keep being inconsistent with the letter J's while I'm reading this. But Jehu and Jehonadab, son of Rechab, went into the temple of Baal. And Jehu said to the servants of Baal, "Look around and see that no one who serves the Lord is here with you, for only servants of Baal." So they went in to make sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had posted 80 men outside with this warning: "If one of you lets any of the men I am placing in your hands escape, it will be your life for his." As soon as Jehu had finished making the burnt offering, he ordered the guards and officers, "Go in and kill them. Let no one escape." So they cut them down with the sword. The guards and officers threw the bodies out and then entered the inner shrine of the temple of Baal. They brought the sacred stone out of the temple and burned it. They demolished the sacred stone of Baal and tore down the temple of Baal, and people have used it for a latrine to this day. So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. The Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all I had in mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation." Yet Jehu was not careful to keep the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. Oof. In those days, the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. Hazael overpowered the Israelites through their territory, east of the Jordan, in all the land of Gilead, the region of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh. From, how the hell do you say this? Aroer, Aroer, Aroer. Well, I'm going to say Aroer, even though it's probably wrong. By the Arnon Gorge through Gilead to Bashan. As for the other events of Jehu's reign, and all that he did, and all of his achievements, are they not written in the books of the annals of the kings of Israel? So Jehu rested with his ancestors, and was burned in Samaria. And Jehoahaz, his son, succeeded him as king. The time that Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. Alright, so chapter 10 is one of those weird-ass chapters where, like, on the one hand, it's like, okay, Jehu is carrying out, God's will and command to get rid of Ahab's family. But the way that Jehu goes about it is pretty brutal, right? And so it's easy to, like, if you look at a historian standpoint, it's just like, oh, look at these guys as grasping for power and being barbarians, to do that. And, there's some legitimate criticism in that, right? And so, like, and of course, Jehu is kind of a screw up too, even though the Bible doesn't actually have God condemn him for that, at least not yet anyway, right? Because I guess, God takes it one step at a time, and I mean, there's merit to that too, right? Because you can't just purge everything at once without basically destroying everything, which is basically what God kind of allows the Babylonians to do, right? Much later on in the story. But basically, Jehu isn't, like, he's pretty bad too, because he, like, worships the golden calves, and so he doesn't worship God alone, and not properly anyway, right? Because of course the golden calves end up being like a distraction for how people worship, right? And of course, you can think of, like, the Christian equivalent was like the iconoclasm issue, right? Where people were, an icon was basically like a depiction of, like, Jesus or a saint or something. And there were some Christians under the camp that, like, no, there should never be things like this, right? Because it can easily lead us to idol worship. But then there were the other side ended up winning the idea that, like, no, like, we should have depictions of what Jesus looked like and be able to pray, using an image or an icon. And that's how it ended up winning. And, that's something that's still to this day in a lot of churches, right? That's why you have those glass paned Jesus pictures, right? And then, of course, some versions of the crucifix actually have, like, a little model of Jesus on it, right? In some churches. And so, stuff like that. And the golden calves, and I'm not doing a one-to-one parallel. I'm not. At least I'm trying not to. Even though I could see the misunderstanding now that I'm bringing it back up. But the golden calf thing is more of a reference back to Egypt, or the Exodus, more accurately, right? Where the Israelites had golden calves made to be like, well, these are the gods who rescued you from Israel, right? But, of course, the other thing, too, that there's another thing about, like, why God is so against, if you will, like, using images to worship him, right? The big one that is probably the most accurate answer is because the way that God wants to be depicted is more human. But at the same time, the biggest temptation would be to worship all human beings, right? But you can't worship human beings, because human beings are just like you're a human being and so is everybody else, right? So you can't worship humans in that sense. But yet, God is always depicted, and he uses the human imagery to be like, this is how you should view me as well. So that's why, like, for instance, the golden calf thing doesn't, God is not okay with the golden calf thing, but, Christians were okay, centuries later with icons, right? Because of the more human elements of the nature of God. But that's its own long talk that we're not going to get into, because maybe I'll do another lecture on, like, how icons work in, like, the Orthodox faith and stuff like that, and Catholicism, because they use it a lot more. In Protestantism, it's kind of like a afterthought. One, because Protestantism came way later than the iconoclasm controversy, right? The icon controversy was not long after the Crusades. I think it's like, no, it's before the Crusades. I think it's like 800 AD or something like that. 800 AD, right? Martin Luther was only like just over 500 years ago, right? So like 15. I didn't say 13. 15 something, right? So, no, that's not right. Yeah, my history mixed up. How long ago was Martin Luther? I mean, we just had Martin Luther Day / Hallows Eve, right? Because Martin Luther Day is the same day, actually. And I know there's that Christian joke to, like, instead of doing Halloween, they do the whole, like, it's Martin Luther Day, right? But anyway, besides the point, the point I'm getting is that it's way later, right? The iconoclasm controversy was like 800 AD. Martin Luther is way later. I think it's either 500 or 300 years. I know a Lutheran is probably going to slap me really hard for, like, not memorizing this, but you get the point. There's quite a bit of time, right, between those two events. So it's not a one-to-one kind of thing to think about. And why Protestants kind of view the icon thing as like an afterthought, right? Because the iconoclasm controversy, which the average Christian wouldn't even know what that is. So, let alone give it any thought whether it's important to their own Christian experience, right? Case in point. I mean, I just use myself as an example. I don't give it much thought either, right? The iconoclasm controversy, right? I don't give it a lot of thought because, once again, like, how I praise and worship God is, I like to think it's pretty in tune with how they were doing the New Testament, right? And of course, for me, it's about the orthopraxy of, well, yes, I pray, read my Bible, and stuff like that. I try to do it every day. There are days when you slip and you don't do it every single day, but more or less every day. And then, of course, you go out and you live out how God inspires you as you read Scripture and pray, right? Loving our neighbor and so on, right? That's what's important to me, right? The other stuff is kind of afterthought to me, right? And so, I mean, that's why this channel also exists, right? And I'm not overly worried about, doctrinal things like the icons and stuff like that. What's more important is that while I'm going out and I'm telling people about Jesus and that they need to be forgiven of their sins and believe in Jesus and all that, right? That's what's important to me. And so the icon thing is kind of like whatever. But the golden calf thing is not a one-to-one parallel, because the golden calf thing goes back to the Exodus, right? And of course, the golden calf thing was a backslide as opposed to, like, loving God by obeying his commands. You basically worship nature and then give it the name of God, right? Which is why, in a lot of mythologies and stuff like that, gods tend to be animals as well, right? Because there's this closer association with nature, right? And then, of course, it's kind of like a way to deify the nature gods, right? By giving them animal form. Because, of course, the animal form gives them a form of which you can worship, right? I mean, that's fun. I mean, sure, the Hinduisms take a different approach. The idea that, like, well, it's the cow is the avatar, the first avatar rather, of Brahma, right? So they'll use wording like that to say, like, well, we don't worship cows, or we don't say that Brahma is a cow, but rather the cow form was his first form, and something like that, right? But once again, it's this closer idea of like associating God with the elements and nature, right? And that's actually why in a lot of mythologies and other religions, and animals are used to depict, the nature gods, right? Because it's that close association with nature, right? Because intuit, like, it's one of those things that, like, it's not a new idea. It's not a new idea, but the idea that humans are the foreign element in nature, right? And you look at the world today, right? Like we're I wouldn't say that, like, oh no, we're definitely in tune with nature. Far from it, right? Because human beings they operate very differently than the natural world order, right? Humans are the counter force. We've just always existed that way, right? And so, more often than not, in mythologies, nature gods are never associated with like a human form, right? Which is ironic then that once again in the Bible, God always uses a human form more often than not, right? Because you think of, like, we go back to Genesis, God is very much a human form, right? Because he walks with Adam and Eve in the garden, so he takes on a human form, or at least it appears that he has a more human form, or at least, like, see, we have to assume it's a human form because it's always something familiar with Adam and Eve, that he walks with them in the dew of the day often, right? So God he's depicted more with a human form. Then of course, you think of, like, when God encounters Abraham multiple times, right? And there's the part where God, Abraham's chilling out, sitting out in the sun one day, and then God shows up, but he shows up in clearly a human form. Because then, like, no one's freaked out that it's some kind of alien thing, right? It's like, oh, it's a person, but then they realize, oh wait, this isn't an ordinary person, it's God, right? Like, the only weird exception where God is associated with like a more nature thing is the book of Exodus, right? Because in the book of Exodus, at the first time Moses encounters God, God is the burning bush, right? Or he's in the burning bush. Which I talked about, that metaphor was actually a very different thing. It's, once again, that scene is also God as a more human form in that scene. And the burning bush is more of the priestly order that God is doing to purify Moses so that Moses could even be in his presence. So there's that. But, when you put that in perspective, well, then God is still in the human form. And so it's interesting. And that's this. I could make this, once again, I wasn't there during the iconoclasm controversy for obvious reasons. I was born in 1988, not 800 AD. So, uh, and now you all know how old I am exactly. But anyway, so Book of Exodus, right? And then of course, yes, I get to do this again. Like, sorry, I don't want to hear this. I'm streaming. But anyway, and of course, yes, I get to do this again. And I swear, you guys probably think I like do this on purpose, right? And this is probably why people think I'm a heretic, right? But, like, when I use the whole Grim Reaper analogy with, like, God in the Book of Exodus, right? The Grim Reaper is he's a humanoid figure, right? In the Gothic sense, he's definitely humanoid. Sure, he's a skeletal humanoid, but he's definitely human, right? He's not like a horse skeleton, right? He's a human skeleton, right? And so if God, the Grim Reaper was taken from the more, killer instinct nature of God, if you will, right? Well, then, once again, when God is being the Grim Reaper, quote unquote, he's taking a human form. You think of, like, the Book of Judges. People encountered God, and they're like, well, shit, we're gonna die because we looked at God despite how unholy we are, right? how would they have realized that it was God after they talked to him? Well, obviously he was in a human form. If he was like in another form, then people would have immediately picked up that like, oh, this is something else. This isn't a human being I'm talking to. But no, like the book of Judges is a good example of like, well, they thought they were talking to just some person, right? When God shows up, you think of like the Samson story is a good example of this, right? Where God, he appears to them and he prophesies and stuff to them and talks about like their son they're gonna have and all that. And then it's only well after the matter of the fact that they realize that it was God that they were talking to, and they're like, well, we're gonna die now because like God is so holy and we are not, right? So throughout, the Old Testament so far, like God is always depicted more human appearances, and so the golden calf thing might be a very, let's go back to the book of Exodus, right? And those interesting parallels. And I'm surprised I never brought this parallel originally, but I guess it wasn't relevant when I was doing Exodus at the time. But I guess it's relevant here. Well, not really, because I guess I like to talk about it more now. But, the contrast is that when God is delivering Israel, he makes himself more human, if that makes sense, right? Because I talked about this in my Halloween stream about how, when God does the 10th plague, aka being the Grim Reaper, he enters into Egypt himself, right? And I made the funny video game analogy that before, when he was doing the other 9 plagues, he was kind of like the wizard summoning spells, in the back, right? But then when the 10th plague occurs, God himself goes in, right? And he takes on a more human form and does this whole, killing the firstborn of Egypt thing. And then, of course, he brings out Israel and he leads them, right? And even though the Bible uses a weird language of like, he's a cloud, so he's the cloud monster, as a cloud, right? But I made that analogy too during the Halloween stream of what's actually going on or what is more likely to be going on. He's still a humanoid figure that leads them. But then when Israel turns to idolatry and starts, doing the whole golden calf thing, right? It takes away the humanity of God. And so that may be a better explanation, if you will, if someone asks you the question, well, why was God so opposed to like, the animal forms? And people say, well, this is who God is, an animal form. It's like, no, that removes the humanity of who God is. And of course, I know it sounds weird to say it that way, that, the humanity of God, but at least in the Old Testament context, because the New Testament's like a no duh, right? He takes on the form of human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. But in the Old Testament, it's still God always takes on a human form, because it is then that like the whole point of God taking on human form is that it's because he relates himself to humans, right? He relates himself to them. Which once again is how, the Christian message works, right? That we can then relate to God because God is a quote unquote a lot more human than we think he is. But of course, there's the flip side too, that since we are made in the image of God, well, we have that connection with the divine more than we think we do, right? It is only because of sin that connection has been martyred. But once again, that's where the forgiveness of Jesus cleanses that, and then we can have that connection again, because that's how God intended it, that we are to have that connection. And so we go back to the book of Kings now, and why, Jehu, he thinks it's okay to like do the whole golden calf thing. But I guess he's missing the point then that like, no, God, you cannot divorce God from his humanity. Which I can see, like, I guess I can see why people might think Jehu thinks God is more animalistic, because, I mean, considering all the stuff Jehu just did in the name of God, right, being pretty barbaric. So, them's the breaks, right? It's a complex thing. It's definitely when we're dealing with the ancient worlds, and people were more barbaric, right? In that sense, but anyway. Now we're back to chapter 11 after that long ass tirade. But like I said, now that I'm rested up and more focused, I can actually talk about like a lot of content within the chapters a lot more than I was able to last week. And I really need to just be better with my time and actually make sure I sleep better as well. It ain't easy when you get to my age, I'll tell you that much. That's probably why older people always complain that they like, oh man, nap time's the best, because I really wish I had more time to sleep. And it's like, yeah, that's definitely true. All right, chapter 10 over. Let's move on to chapter 11. Chapter 11. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. That went from 0 to 60 real quick. But Jehosheba, I think that's how you say that, daughter of King Jehoram and sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes, who were about to be murdered. I like how it's just very forward with that. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah, so he was not killed. He remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah ruled the land. In the 7th year of Jehoiada, in the 7th year, not of Jehoiada. We're going to do that again. Verse 4. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent for the commanders of units of 100 and Carides and guards and had them brought to him at the temple of the Lord. We're in Judah, by the way. He made a covenant with them and put them under oath at the temple of the Lord. He then showed them the king's son. He commanded them, saying, I need a voice for this guy. Sorry, I'm playing it because I need a voice for this guy. I want to do a different voice. I need a different voice for this guy. This is what you are to do. You are in the 3 companies that are going on duty on the Sabbath. A third of you guarding the royal palace. A third at the Sur gate, and a third at the gate behind the guard, who takes turns guarding the temple. And you, who are in the other 2 companies that normally go off Sabbath duty, are all to guard the temple for the king. Station yourselves around the king, and each of you with a weapon in hand. Anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death, and stay close to the king wherever he goes. The commanders of units of 100 did as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his man, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath and those who were going off duty, and came to Jehoiada the priest. Then he gave the commanders the spears and shields that belonged to King David, and that were in the temple of the Lord. The guards, each with weapon in hand, stationed themselves around the king, near the altar and the temple from the south side to the north side of the temple. Jehoiada brought out the king's son and put the crown on his head. He presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" When Athaliah heard the noise made by the guards and the people, she went to the people at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king, standing by the pillar, as the custom was. The officers and trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her robes and called out, "Treason! Treason!" Jehoiada the priest ordered the commanders of units of 100, who were in charge of the troops, "Bring her out between the ranks, and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had said, "She must not be put to death in the temple of the Lord." So they seized her as she reached the place where the horses entered the palace grounds, and there she was put to death. Jehoiada then made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. All the people of the land went to the temple of Baal to tear it down. They smashed the altars and idols to pieces and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. Then Jehoiada, the priest, posted guards at the temple of the Lord. He took with him the commanders of hundreds, the Karaites, the guards, and all the people of the land. And together they brought the king down from the temple of the Lord and went into the palace, entering by the way of the gate of the guards. The king then took his place on the royal throne. All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was calm, because Athaliah had been slain with the sword at the palace. Now Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Yeah, chapter 11 is a weird-ass chapter. It's weird. It's a very strange story. Well, for starters, it just makes the weird jump between, like, Israel to Judah. Now we're back in Judah, right? And the funny thing is that, like, you know, the last 2 chapters we just read was like, okay, well, Israel was, like, in bonkers land, right? Everything is just crazy. And you think, okay, well, the north part is crazy. Maybe the northerners are just nuts, right? But then you get to chapter 11 and it transitions to the south and it's just like, nah, man. The south is just as bonkers, right? It's crazy down here. And so we have the story of Joash, right? And Joash is this, like, child king, so that's already bonkers, right? Well, he's not even king yet because his crazy-ass mom is going around slaughtering everyone else in the family so that she can maintain power, right? Because, you know, everyone craps on Jezebel for being like a crazy, power-hungry psychopath, but clearly Athaliah is cut from the same cloth, right? Because she's also a crazy, power-hungry psychopath, right? That's why she goes around and kills all the boys in the family. And so she's trying to solidify power. And then, you know, another funny thing about this chapter that I'm going to point out is, like, where once again there's an exception to, like, parts of the Ten Commandments even, but once again there's a tier list in the Ten Commandments. So stealing, apparently there's an exception to stealing now. So Exodus 1 had the exception to lying. Now we have the exception to theft. And the exception to theft is, once again, you know, to save someone's life, like, directly, right? And I have to say that because you can't say, like, well, I'm going to steal someone's money to pay for something for someone else, and that will, quote-unquote, save their life. That's not the same thing, obviously. Here, it's like, look, if I don't hide this kid, quote-unquote, steal him away and his wet nurse, if I don't hide them, they're dead, right? And if I do nothing, well, then my negligence, led to someone's murder, right? And that can actually fall on your conscience. That's the same thing with, like, the Good Samaritan Act basically covers that as well, right? Where, once again, the Good Samaritan Act actually does allow, like, if you had to use extreme force, and, the easy example to use is, like, let's say you had to stop a school shooter, right? A guy's he has a gun, he's about to go into a school, and you assume that because he has a gun and he's going into a school, he's going to do, a school shooting. You have the moral obligation to use whatever means necessary to stop them. Even if you had to kill the guy to do it, you would not be held guilty on any level, even on a spiritual one, right? Because, once again, the other guy would be committing evil and murder. And so that's the exception, right? So, once again, the tier list in the Ten Commandments is, do not murder is rule 6. Do not steal is rule 8, right? So, number 6 is higher than number 8, so number 6 gets priority. Do not commit murder, right? So, stealing away the young prince so that he doesn't get murdered is an allowable exception to the rule. So before people say, well, what if I had to steal this to save someone's life? Unless it's direct, like in this case, then probably not. But a direct, to directly save someone's life, even if you had to if you had to kidnap the prince, which is basically what, who is this that did this again? This this unsung hero. See, that's how you can tell a hero's unsung, because I have to go look it up again. Uh, where is this unsung hero? Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, and sister of Ahaziah. Okay, so yeah, this unsung hero, this badass woman right here, that's what I want. That's a biblical woman right there. um, you know, that would be the exception to the rule, right? So she steals away. Well, I guess, how is she related to him again? So she's the daughter of King Jehoram and sister of Ahaziah. So she's Joash's aunt. So good auntie of the year right there. I had to check how they were related too. I'm like, I assume if she's a princess, she's obviously related. So yeah, she's Joash's aunt. And that, badass of the week, right? Unsung hero right here. But does the right thing, even if she has to do a quote unquote bad thing, kidnapping, to do it, right? Because, well, she's a princess, so she would have we assume that she had knowledge that Athaliah was gonna do it, well, was doing, or was going to do what she was doing, right? And so, for her, if she was negligent, right, that would fall on her, morally, possibly, right, for allowing murder to happen. Which is why, once again, that it's all the same, that the pacifism argument doesn't work, because sometimes you have to kill in order to save lives, right? I mean, we just had Remembrance Day yesterday, right? It's the same kind of thing, right? Like, war is an ugly thing in general, but we always remember the people who fought in the Great Wars, World War I and World War II, because what was the alternative, right? The alternative would be to let bad people go around and just slaughter more people mercilessly, right? Like, you have to stop evil like that, and sometimes you have to get your hands messy to do it. That's the thing that I hope you remembered Remembrance Day yesterday for that reason, right? And that's the other thing too. And like 21st century living in Canada is like, we ought to be thankful, because like, thank God I don't have to get my hands dirty, right? Thank God I don't, because that it sounds like, you think of like how ugly war is. It's like, thank God I don't have to do that, right? Because that would be it's absolutely terrible, right? To fight in a war and stuff like that. But there were brave people that did, so that people like you and me don't have to, right? And thank God that I don't have to, right? Because it's way more terrible than it sounds, right? But maybe that's because I'm a coward in that sense, right? But once again, that's all the more reason to praise the bravery of those who fought you know in various wars, not just the Great Wars, which is what Remembrance Day focuses on, but even like the last couple of wars in more recent time, as stupid as they were, but you still have to honor people's bravery to stand up to tyrants and stuff like that. Anything else about chapter 11? I mean, there's really just the South is just as crazy as the North. This is the main point I had. So there's parallels between Athaliah and Jezebel, right? So, because I guess we're talking about her again. Power-hungry psychopaths. That's the best way of describing them. Like, Athaliah is like, her whole thing is that, like, no, I want to be in charge. Now that her husband is dead. So he's like, I'm going to be in charge. We're not going to just pass it off to the next boy in the next boy in line, right? Because, I mean, you look at Joash as a case in point, right? Joash is like 7 when he becomes king. What's a 7-year-old going to do, like, to lead a country? Because, I mean, he's a child. he can't be all that competent, right? But then, you know, the funny thing is that, like, even if, like, a boy was crowned, she would still be in charge. But of course, what she probably wanted was, like, to be in charge for, like, as for the rest of her life, right? Not just until the king grew up. She wanted to be in charge forever, basically. And so that's probably why she did the ridiculous thing that she does, right? Going around killing all the boys in the family to maintain her power. And I mean, that's just pathological narcissism right there, right? Like, look, lady, the world doesn't revolve around you. Like, chill out. No one gets to maintain their leadership positions forever. I mean, the Bible is case in point of people who tried that and we watch as that fails miserably, right? I mean, even when, like, King David was, like, overly confident in his power and was like, no, I'll do whatever I can to sustain my power. Yeah, that didn't work out all too well for him, right? King Saul, even worse, right? So, yeah, not a good idea to just try and hold on to power forever, because that's not a good thing, you know. It's just not. It doesn't take a lot of brains to figure that out. At least you think it wouldn't, but then you also see some of the power mongering today. Yeah, shows what I know. So then chapter 11 ends with, like, okay, Athaliah gets executed because she's terrible. You know, killing a bunch of young boys, probably not a good thing on your track record. So, yeah, she gets brutally executed in a stable of all places. So, like, zero dignity, and a lot of parallels with Jezebel in the north. So, once again, the whole thing of, like, the south is just as crazy as the north. You know, she gets brutally killed in a place that's, like, of low respect, right? Because with Jezebel getting trampled under horses, and then Athaliah getting executed in a stable, right? So, you know, you're beneath the horses, right? And what's normally beneath horses? A lot of horse shit, right? So, yeah, not a good place. You know, that terrible way for both of these women to go, right? Just terrible. So, there's that. And then finally we have, like, Jehoiada. I think that's his name, the priest. Yeah, Jehoiada, who's, like, unlike the north, where once again they're not part of. There's no Davidic line, so the way kings are brought up are very different, and, you know, we've just read with Jehu, kind of random too. But here, you know, Jehoiada takes the smart route. He's like, okay, I'm going to train up Joash. You know, he's a little kid, so it'll be easy to, you know, teach him what's right instead of, you know, going before that rebellious teenage phase or something, right? You know, teach him what's right early so that he knows to do what's right. And so that's what Jehoiada takes it upon himself to do. And, you know, Jehoiada he's a good guy, you know, at least a half decent priest anyway. So he's, and then the funny thing is, like, about this chapter that I like to kind of point out, like, a more, not humorous element, but I find it kind of interesting. And it's kind of a cool thing to think about. But, like, sure, you know, you read in, like, the David stories about how, like, David was kind of like a kind of King Arthur kind of thing. So he has, like, his, like, close consort of buddies, and they're kind of like the Knights of the Round Table, and they have, like, legends and stuff about them and cool stuff like that. But here you read this, when you read chapter 11, you get this kind of, like, impression of, like, the MI6. So for those of you youngsters who don't know what that is and weren't into those kind of, like, movies, the MI6 is, like, a thing in, like, spy movies. Okay, no, I mean, I guess even you younger guys would know of, like, the Kingsman, right? Kingsman. The MI6 is, you know, the Kingsman, right? Of course, the Kingsman kind of makes it on an absurd level, but I mean, it's a science fiction spy movie, right? Kingsman, but kind of that idea, right? Us older guys might be more familiar with like James Bond, right? That kind of thing. And the MI6 was basically this, the secret agent organization where like they serve the crown. And then they're like, they double as like the Queen's bodyguards. Well, our modern version, let's like the MI6, like, and yes, the MI6 is a real thing in the real world, but it's obviously not like like high levels of espionage like in the movies, right? The MI6 in real life is basically just like they double as like the Queen's personal bodyguards, and they're also like the FBI, so they hold like that high level of legal authority, like the FBI does. The FBI is basically, well, I mean, if you think of it this way, the FBI is just the American non-crown version of the MI6. And so the funny thing when you read chapter 11 in Second Kings is that like it kind of feels like excuse me, Jehoiada has this whole like MI6 thing going on with like these 300 guys, 303 I guess, because each group has a commander. So there's three groups of 100, and each one has a commander. So it's 303 guys that are basically like an MI6, and it's kind of like interesting to think about. And I like to entertain the idea that like, dude, man, like when Jehoiada gives these instructions of like, if anyone dares come close to the king, you take them out, right? There's got to be some epic ass stories that you could come up with that, right? Like 007 style, like ancient Israel version of 007, right? Because one of them would have been 007. If you go from, 1 to 303. You gotta have a 007 in there, right? So, I don't know, I just find that as very entertaining in my mind, because once again, I love spy movies as well. I mean, what's not to love about, like, films about espionage, right? Because everybody imagines of like, taking out corrupt organizations with like sick, stealthy maneuvers and detective skills and spy work. And I mean, how is espionage not a cool idea, right? Like in films, that's probably why the spy movies were so popular, and why they, to an extent, still are. But I just kind of think that thing's kind of going on. Maybe this, I mean, not exactly the same, but like, it's kind of cool that like the king has this like there's a secret organization of protecting the king, right? In the case of King Joash, is like this espionage group, and they're like they're kind of like parallels of like MI6, right? They're his personal bodyguard, but they're like in secret and stuff. It's just really cool to think about. At least I think it's cool to think about. And, of course, once again, another close parallel is their closeness to the crown. This is why the FBI, you don't get that, like, kind of umph with the FBI. Because, once again, the FBI is more about the legal... They're more... We recognize the FBI more about, like, the legal authority that they have. Which is obviously very important. But the funny thing is that the MI6 is exactly... They have that legal authority, in the UK. Just like how the FBI would in America. But then, of course, the added element that kind of adds this, like, class, if you will, to the MI6. Not to say that the FBI is classless, obviously not. But, the certain thing that adds, like, a level of class to, like, the MI6 would be, like, well, they're faithful to the crown, right? And so they're, like, these high legal authorities, secret agents for the queen. Well, that's a cool idea, right? And that's why, once again, Kingsman and James Bond are so popular, right? That's why they're so cool in a lot of people's minds. Because, I mean, I'm sure a lot of I definitely have thought, like, man, I wish I was part of something like that, right? That's like a cool idea, right? And they have that level of, like, class, too. That's why, like, the MI6 is kind of viewed to be, like, so cool, right? Once again, using James Bond as the example. I don't know, I just thought that was a cool thing to think about, because, like, that's the vibes I get from chapter 11. That like when Jehoiada gives these guys like their instructions, and they're like secret agents, and it's kind of really cool to think of it that way. It certainly adds a fun spin to think about too. And now you can like fantasize in your mind about like, man, some of the sick missions these guys probably go on, right, to like protect the king, right? Because no doubt, like people would have been hunting for Joash, right? So how did the secret agents deal with that? Right? That's a cool thing to think about, right? Dun 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 dun. Now you know which Bond was probably the first one I saw with that terrible humming I did. Anyway, that's enough horsing around. Haha! Let's just read chapter 12 and then we're going to basically finish the stream because chapter 12 is what I said I would read up to. So let's read through chapter 12 and then we'll get to the end of the stream. Chapter 12. In the 7th year of Jehu, Joash became king. And he reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years. Yikes, that means he only lived to 47. His mother's name was Zebiah, and she was born from Beersheba. So she's not a local. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. All the years of Jehoiada, the priest instructed him. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burnt incenses there. Joash said to the priests, collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord, the money collected in the census, the money received from personal vows, and the money brought voluntarily to the temple. Let every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers and then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple. But by the 23rd year of King Joash, the priest still had not repaired the temple. Therefore Joash summoned Jehoiada, the priest, and the other priests and asked them, why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Take no more money from your treasurers, but hand it over for repairing the temple. The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money from the people, and that they would not repair the temple themselves. Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in its lid. He placed it beside the altar. Give me a second here. Let's do that again. Verse 9. Jehoiada the priest took a chest and buried a hole in its lid. He placed it beside the altar. On the right side, as one enters the temple of the Lord, the priests who guarded the entrance put into the chest all the money that was brought to the temple of the Lord. Whenever they saw that there was a large amount of money in the chest, the royal secretary and the high priest came, counted that money, put into the temple, and then put it into bags. When the money had been determined, they gave the money to the men appointed to supervise the work of the temple, and with it they paid those who worked on the temple of the Lord, carpenters and builders, the masons and stonecutters. They purchased timber and blocks of dressed stone for the repair of the temple of the Lord, and met all the other expenses of restoring the temple. The money brought into the temple was not spent for making silver basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, trumpets, or any other articles of gold or silver for the temple of the Lord. It was paid to the workers, who used it to repair the temple. They did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty. If only that were the case in work today. The money from the guilt offerings and sin offerings was not brought into the temple of the Lord. It belonged to the priests. Now about this time, Hazael, the king of Aram, went up and attacked Gath and captured it. Then he turned to attack Jerusalem. But Joash, the king of Judah, took all the sacred objects dedicated by his predecessors, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram and Ahaziah, the kings of Judah, and the gifts he himself had dedicated, and all the gold found in the treasuries of the temple of the Lord, and of the royal palace. He then sent them to Hazael, king of Aram, who then withdrew from Jerusalem. Just straight out bought the dude out. That is one way to win battles. As for the other events of the reign of Joash and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? His officials conspired against him and assassinated him at Beth Millo. Damn. On the road down to Silla. The officials who murdered him were, oh goodness, Jozabad, son of Shemaeth, and Jehozabad, son of Shomer. So we got two. Okay, we have Jozabad and Jehozabad. He died and was buried with his ancestors. Joash, died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. And Amaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. Alright, so chapter 12. Let's just do a quick breakdown because there's not a lot to talk about. Like, sure, Joash himself, a lot of people like to talk about him because he's like one of the few good kings that were around in like Judah's history, because a lot of them are pretty awful, right? We did just have like, well, Ahaziah wasn't too bad, but he had a pretty terrible wife. And Ahaziah was kind of apathetic. That's probably why she was so, like, got away with being so bad. But, and then of course we get other kings later on that are going to be pretty awful. Because, like, there's like one more decent king, and that's Hezekiah when we get to him. But, like, basically, Joash is one of the few good ones. And there's like a bunch of bad kings in Judah. But then, of course, you know, there's the major oof that Joash only, like, he doesn't live that long. He only lives to like 47. But that's because he gets assassinated, right? Which is just like, oof. And then, of course, you know, the irony of, like, you know, I was just making this whole parallel with, like, the MI6. And, I mean, you watch something like GoldenEye and you have, like, traitors within the MI6, right? So that's kind of what ends up happening, except unlike in GoldenEye, you know, the good guys don't win. The bad MI6 members, if you will, end up succeeding and they assassinate the king, right? And so, I mean, that's what I assume with these officials, right? Maybe it's not one of the MI6 guys. Maybe it's one of the other officials. Which then, once again, the ball drops on the MI6 guys because they didn't do their job. But that's besides the point. But basically, you know, Joash gets assassinated and then his son has to take his place. And then the funny thing is that, like, well, Joash dies at a pretty young age, right? Because he's only 47. He was 7 when he became king, and then he died 40 years later, right? When his reign ends and his assassination. That's kind of the throwdown of, like, this story. There's not much to talk about chapter 12. I know a lot of people like to talk about how good Joash is because, you know, he goes through the effort of repairing the temple. Because, you know, you think of all these bad kings or apathetic kings. Because, once again, the kings of Judah are not painted to be, like, terrible, like the kings of Israel were. But clearly there was, like, a lot of inaction. Because, you know, the temple ends up being in, like, disrepair, right? Now, if you remember back in the beginning of the Book of Kings, you know, Solomon built the temple to be, like, this majestic, you know, grandeur, you know, palace-like place, right? Because, once again, you know, Solomon kind of viewed the temple as, like, God's palace, if that makes sense. Even though, you know, obviously Solomon knows that, like, well, there's nothing I could ever build that could ever, you know, compare to your majesty, right? Because, you know, God is God and all that, right? So, but at the same time, you know, Solomon still built the temple to be like this majestic place. But then we get to Joash here, you know, like almost 2 centuries later. About a century and a half later. And now the temple's in somewhat disrepair. And so Joash is all like, and the Bible hints that it's actually in pretty bad shape because, first of all, Joash, well, we don't really know when he issued the order. right? It's obviously not when he was 7 years old. Let's say he did it when he was 15 years old, right? But then by the time he's like, let's say he issues it when he's 15 years old to, get the money from the treasuries and stuff and use it to fund repairing the temple. But of course, Joash doesn't. I assume he made the original issue when he was young because he probably didn't know how repairing a temple works. Because the funny thing is that, like, what the Bible implies is that he might have had the priests try and do it, but the priests aren't tradesmen. They don't know how to do stuff like repairing cracks in walls and stuff like that. That's not in their pay grade. So when Joash is 30, 23rd year of his reign plus 7 years how old he is, makes him 30. So Joash is 30, and he's like, all right, why haven't you guys actually finished the temple? And the priests are like, well, because we can't. We don't know how to, one. Though that's more implied, not like flat out said. The priests could not do it. So then Joash gets all this, he pulls out all the stops, right? All the treasury money and stuff like that. All the money that goes in to pay for the priests and stuff like that, even, right? And says, all right, we're using all of this to make sure the temple gets repaired, and we're going to hire the right guys, right? And then the Bible points out they get these carpenters, builders, masons, stonecutters, etc. They get the right guys, and they're like, all right, we're going to do this right. And they repair the temple, right? And they succeed in doing that, but of course it costs them quite a bit of money. But to be fair, Joash was probably thinking along the same veins as Solomon, right? Like, this is supposed to be like a place where we worship God. This is supposed to be like a place of high, ordinance, right? We put the utmost attention to it, and we're gonna we're gonna make sure we do a good job with this. Is basically what Joash is thinking, right? And rightfully so. And so they go through and they repair the temple. So that's basically it of the chapter, right? And then we get the last, after he repairs the temple. Well, there's that one part where, like, I guess they had enough money to, like, pay off Hazael. And the funny thing is that, like, how old must Hazael be at this point? Because Hazael's been around for, like, 3 generations of, like, kings at this point, right? Because we do remember that, like, who's Jehu's dad again? I can't remember it. Gotta check up Jehu's dad. Or not Jehu. The king before Jehu. We have Ahab, and then Ahab's dad. Ahab's dad is Jehoram. And Hazael was around during Jehoram, right? So when we look at, like, well, once again, Aram is to the north, right? So we have to go back to Israel for a little bit here. So we had Jehoram, and then Ahab, and then Joram, right? Now Joram is an adult when he dies, but Hazael was king of Aram when his grandfather was around. Now, of course, to assume that, like, okay, Jehoram might have been a lot older, or at least a fair distance older than Hazael was. Hazael might have been a young guy when he was crowned king, and then he encounters Jehoram, right? Hazael might have been a younger guy. Okay, that would be the only argument I could accept for him to still be around, right? After Jehoram's death, or sorry, not Jehoram, after Joram's death, the grandson of a guy you fought way back when you were a kid, right? Like, that's a weird thing to think about too, right? Like, okay, I want to play around a bit with Hazael, because Hazael, like, once again, this guy's been around for a while, right? So Hazael fought Jehoram probably when he was a young guy himself, right? I mean, that's the only argument I'm going to accept, because otherwise we're going to say, like, this guy's, like, over 100 years old and still fighting. I mean, Abraham was able to pull that off, but Abraham lived in, like, older times where people were more magical or something, right? Whatever, right? So, but Hazael might have been a young guy when he fought Jehoram way back, right? he fights against he does have some skirmishes with Ahab. And now let's say Ahab and and Hazael are roughly the same age, right? Or like Hazael's a little bit older. Well, then Hazael lives, or sorry, not Hazael. Ahab lives for quite a while before he dies, right? Ironically, at the hands of Hazael. Well, one of his guys, but you get the point, right? One of Hazael's guys kills crap, what's his name? It's slipping my mind now. Ahab, right? One of Hazael's guys killed Ahab. Hazael might be like in his 50s at this point, right? Similar age to Ahab, right? Ahab was like probably near 50 when he died, and Hazael would have been the same age. But then some time passes, and then we have Joram and Ahaziah, sorry, and Ahaziah, who is Joash's dad, right? Joram and Ahaziah are two kings that go up against him, right? They fight Hazael again. So Hazael's fought through like he's fought through like 3 generations at this point of like kings of Judah and Israel. Well, mainly with Israel, but he's fought like 3 generations of these guys. He's fought through 3 generations of Hebrews. That's how I should have worded it at the get-go, right? And then we get to Joash, who's like way down the line, right? How old must Hazael be? He must be like well over like 80 years old at this point and still fighting, kicking ass, I guess. It's just one of those things that's like weird to think about. It's like, unless this Hazael's a different Hazael, right? Maybe Hazael's a title, or he's Hazael the second, but the Bible never bothered to call him that. But if he's the same Hazael, he's like over 80 years old at this point. Which I guess the buying out thing might actually make sense, that Joash just buys him out because he's like, look, man, you're not as young and spry as you used to be. You probably don't want to pick a fight. Here, I'll just pay you off and you can go away. And it works, right? Just bribe your enemy to go away. I mean, it works sometimes. And maybe accepting a bribe was easier for Hazael in his old age. Because I assume he's like a super old dude. Once again, this guy's fought through like 3.5, almost 4 generations of Hebrews. Right? He's got to be an old dude at this point. I don't know. I just think it's kind of humorous when you have instances like this, right? The Bible's no stranger to like having these warlords be like old ass dudes too, right? I mean, that's probably why like in a lot of mythologies as well, the warlords are always these old guys, right? And the real miracle is like, wait, so you're a warlord and you're super old. How did you survive every other encounter, right? I mean, that just kind of adds points that like, well, that's one reason why they're the warlord, right? Because they're just so awesome that they don't die. And so there's that element. But then like but then at the same time it's like, but realistically in war, right? Like lots of people die. So how do these warlords keep surviving, right? Which just makes them seem that just adds like to the cool factor, right? Like these guys are clearly awesome, right? Clearly this dude's awesome. So I don't know, I just find it humorous that Hazael is still around when Joash is king, right? Now I could actually do a math calculation and probably figure out how old or how long his like Hazael fighting Hebrew kings could actually go. Once again, some of these the kings' ages overlap, right? So there's that. But I mean, for Joash and Hazael to meet, well, once again, I can't really use my context as a good example. Like I'm going to use like my own age as a context, but once again, not the best reference, because once again, ancient world people had kids earlier, right? So the span between like generations was shorter. But then like at the same time though, if it's 4 generations, for Joash and Hazael to meet would be the equivalent of me meeting someone that like my great grandfather got into a gang fight with back when Chinatown was a, shady place in Vancouver's history, right? Because, well, that's going to be its own crazy story for another day. Maybe I'll do that for a podcast for one of my other crazy story podcasts, which I haven't done in a while. But maybe that'll be something fun we can do in the near future. Do like a more crazy stories with the streaming Parson kind of thing. But basically, my great grandfather, that's like over like almost 100 years ago, and back then, Great Depression. The Great Depression was a thing, and so for people to make money, some people did some pretty shady things, especially if you were a Chinese immigrant, right? So my great grandfather was involved in some pretty shady things, and so because of course that's how Chinese immigrants kind of had to do things. Unfortunately, it's just an ugly part of history. You just gotta have to deal with it. But the equivalent, Hazael meeting Joash is the equivalent of like, let's say I encountered a gangster, some like over like 100-year-old gangster that my great grandfather knew. That's the equivalent, which I don't think that's ever happened because that would be absurd, right? But that just adds to like when people read a story like this, like, wow, that's crazy that Hazael and Joash actually meet, right? Because that's like 3.5 generations of Hebrews later that and then this just begs the question with Hazael, like, how good of a warlord is he then if he's still fighting the same people after all this time too? So it's kind of like a weird, like, at first Hazael's kind of cool because he's been fighting for as long as he has been. At the same time, he's still fighting the same people and hasn't beaten them. So, I mean, then again, ancient wars were different, right? Because sometimes people fought for the purpose of fighting, and that just makes war even more senseless back then. Because like, we're gonna sacrifice people's lives just because we can, right? Because yeah, the ancient world, people were pretty barbaric like that. Kings fight for the sake of fighting, right? And sacrificing their minions' lives. It's pretty terrible when you put it like that, right? It is pretty terrible, but that just kind of how it was. So that could be a reason why Hazael didn't conquer them, right? Because once again, when they say like the king of Aram, Aram isn't like this huge ass country, right? It's like it's a warring province tribe thing, right? And you look at like Israel and Judah, they're not big places either, right? And so, Aram is just another place like that, and they just like warring warlords just kind of beating each other up because that's what they do, right? Because they're bored out of their minds or something, right? But at the same time, it's just funny that like Hazael has survived this whole time, so it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just funny to me. And then Joash just straight up pays him out, right? Just like, okay, I think your fighting days are over, old man, right? I mean, to be fair, if there's a 100-year-old gangster, I'd probably do that too. I just pay him. I was like, here, take some money and go away. Leave me alone. Of course, I could use myself as like a what's that word? A parallel. Not really parallel, but you get the idea. Like a equivalency to Joash, because at this point, Joash and I would be the same age, right? He'd be in his like 30s, and I too would be. I'm in my 30s as well. After all, I told you how old I was, so by giving you my birth year. But basically, like, yeah, Joash and I just meeting like some super old dude that our great grandfather might have known, right? Or would have known in this case, because like once again, Hazael has been fighting Hebrews for like over 3 generations. So I just think that's hilarious. Anyway, I think that's it for the reading stream. I'm basically done. We've covered the 4 chapters we wanted to cover. So if you have any questions, or comments, place them now because we're gonna end the stream pretty soon. I'm just gonna do a bit of housekeeping before we end the stream. But of course, there's really not much to talk about at this point for housekeeping. Just letting you know that, Monday, 4 o'clock Pacific time, streaming Parson podcast. Just gonna talk about excuse me, I'm burping a lot because I just drank like that fruit punch. But anyway, we have a regular podcast on Monday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. And then, of course, Thursday, Throwback Thursday episode of Heroes of My Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty. Hopefully I'll be able to finish Descendants soon. Because, I'm going to need at least 2 more. I'm going to need at least 2 more videos. Because it's going to take that long to finish it. Because that's how long these maps take, right? And, I mean, to be fair, like, the last couple weeks, I had to redo parts of the map, right? What was it? 2 weeks ago's video? Well, 3 weeks ago's video was basically made void because 2 weeks ago I had to redo that whole part of the game, right? So we'll see. We'll see how long it takes to finish the epic battle. But basically, we have another epic battle part coming up on next Thursday, and next Friday we'll continue the Book of Second Kings. Probably just read 4 more chapters. So that would be like what, chapter 13 to 16 would be next week. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. You can even read ahead if you want to. And come with like questions and whatever. And your notes and stuff like that, which would be great for, as we go through Second Kings. But anyway, that's it for that. I'm done for reading for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for coming to this reading stream. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Have a great Friday night as well. I'll see you guys next week. You guys, take care of yourselves too. God bless you. Say bye to everybody. She hates this. She hates this.